Yes, another video about comics. So I got a few questions in my last video, like how can I find a comic book shop near where I live? What's a good comic series to start with? Who's your favorite comic book superhero? And OMG, Travis, you are so awesome! Which isn't so much a question as it is me being pretentious. So I put a link in the information, first link there, you can just enter in your zip code and it'll let you know a comic book retailer near where you live. Other country-ish people, I'm not exactly sure if this website will work for your country, but Brits, you shouldn't have a problem because your country is tiny. If you're wondering where to start with where you're familiar with and then branch off from there. I myself started in the Spider-Man universe, but I'll get to that in a second. If you enjoy the Iron Man movies, you'd probably really enjoy the Iron Man comic. Robert Downey Jr. did an amazing job. Perfect Tony Stark. That being said, movies should not be your driving force behind your comic reading interests. I mean, as much as the X-Men universe has been told and retold and rewritten, X3 totally butchered everything. Unnecessary deaths, characters behave differently than they had in the first two movies, and don't even get me started on the Phoenix. But this video's not about that. So I mentioned before my interest in the Spider-Man universe, but Spider-Man is actually not my favorite character. My favorite character is the Scarlet Spider. Back when I was 8 years old, I was in the car with my dad and we were going on a very long trip, and being an 8-year-old, I was bored. Sometime along the drive, we stopped at a drugstore and he bought me a comic book, my very first comic book. So like a lot of businesses put their first dollar in a frame, I put my first comic in a frame. But as an 8-year-old kid, I was a little confused. It was called The Amazing Spider-Man, but that wasn't Spider-Man. After reading and rereading, because it was a very long car drive, I learned that that was Ben Reilly. So for those of you who don't know who the Scarlet Spider is, let me learn you some. So there was this villain, the Jackal, who obtained a tissue sample of Peter Parker without his knowledge, and then using the tissue sample, he tried cloning Peter. Most of them he dubbed failures, but finally he was able to make a perfect clone. The clone even had all of Peter's memories, and he believed himself to be the real Peter Parker. So the Jackal dressed up the clone in a Spider-Man outfit and sent him to go fight the other Spider-Man, and there was a big battle. So during the battle, there was an explosion, the second Spider-Man died, Peter took him up to a smokestack and tossed him in to dispose of the body. Because of all the confusion, Doc Connors was actually running a test to find out if Peter was actually the real Peter Parker, but Peter was content in being the real Spider-Man, so he just threw the tests away without even reading them, and everything was fine. Until a few years later. This mysterious guy shows up in New York City visiting Aunt May while she's in the hospital really sick, and Peter doesn't know who this guy is, but finally they run into each other. And this is where things get tricky. The clone had returned. The clone called himself Ben Reilly, Ben after Peter's uncle and Reilly after Aunt May's maiden name, and he stuck around in New York City to try to make a life for himself. Since Ben had Spider-Man's powers, not to mention memories, he became a superhero in the same regard. But obviously the name Spider-Man was taken, so he went with something with a little more color. The Scarlet Spider. You can see the noticeable difference in their outfits. After a lot of mistrust between them, they actually started fighting alongside of each other. And Ben and Peter would introduce each other as cousins, and they would have this awesome brotherly bond. Then there was this whole thing about a cybernetic Scarlet Spider going around ruining the Scarlet Spider's name, and Mary Jane and Peter Parker had gotten married and they wanted to move away. So since the Scarlet Spider name was kind of ruined and Peter was moving away and New York needed a Spider-Man, who better to take up the mantle than Ben? Ben had a new costume, new identity, and plus a scientist revealed that he was actually the true Peter Parker he had been this whole time. How amazing for him! At least for a while. So Mary Jane and Peter Parker come back to New York because they miss it or something, and Peter and Ben are toying with the idea of having two Spider-Men. But they had just one little issue, just one tiny little snag. Norman Osborn, the original Green Goblin. Arguably Spider-Man's greatest enemy, it turns out Norman Osborn had been orchestrating everything from the beginning. The Jackal, the clones. I mean, we're talking about a man who wanted to ruin Peter Parker's life even more than the Jackal did. So the Goblin was going to blow up the Daily Bugle and kill a bunch of innocent people. There was a big fight that ensued, and just as the Goblin's glider is about to impale Peter, Ben jumps in front of it and takes the hit. Ben, of course, dies, but as he's dying, Peter sees that his body is deteriorating faster than normal, which was meant to show that Ben was actually the clone the whole time, that Peter was the real Peter Parker. So because Peter and MJ are back in New York, Peter becomes Spider-Man again. Now, a lot of people really don't like the clone saga in Spider-Man, and I gotta be honest, my little synopsis barely scratched the surface of all the characters and clones and story arcs involved. It just wasn't really well received, and people thought that the plot twists were unnecessary and annoying, and they just wanted closure. The comic book writers even poked fun at the whole thing by writing this comic, 101 Ways to End the Clone Saga. The entire comic is of the writers bouncing all of these what if ideas off of each other, and it's really funny. But seeing as how I was a kid when I started reading about Ben Reilly, I sort of had this weird affection for the character. I mean, while Peter is acting as Spider-Man, Ben is kinda lost. He doesn't get to live the life that he thinks that he deserves. He's confused. He thinks that he's the real Peter Parker, but there's this other guy with the same memories doing what he wants to do. He has to essentially start over and make a new life for himself. He's a very real character. As real as a clone of Spider-Man can be. You know what I mean. But now I'm curious about you. Tell me about your favorite superheroes. They can be movie, television, comic books. But there's just one catch. You have to tell me why you find them amazing. I look forward to reading your comments. I can't believe I forgot to verbally mention this in my last video, but May 5th is Free Comic Book Day. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like, Free Comic Book Day. Nearly every comic book store in the country will be giving away free comic books all day on the 5th. Yes, free. It's a promotion that comic book companies do to get people more interested in reading and collecting comic books. So if you get the chance, I definitely recommend you check it out. I'm going to this really awesome comic book store in Cleveland, and I sent them a message on Twitter asking if I'd be able to film inside because I really want to do a video that day, and their place is awesome. Hopefully I'm allowed, so fingers crossed.